A black CEO was removed from his VIP seat for a more important passenger. 5 minutes later, he owned the entire airline, and the crew went silent. They thought taking his seat would put him in his place. They didn't realize the man they pushed aside controlled more than anyone on board. Subscribe if you believe dignity always finds altitude. Sir, we've had a seat reassignment due to an internal scheduling issue. The words struck like a switchblade in velvet. Jeremiah Voss looked up, his hands still resting on the leather armrest of the VIP lounge chair, his laptop screen casting a soft glow on his face. The man in front of him, Clark Rendell, middle-aged, ruddy-cheeked, and clinging to a clipboard like a lifeline, wore the kind of grin one mastered after years of passive corporate deflection. "I'm going to need to move you to economy." Jeremiah didn't flinch. His face remained unreadable, the quiet poise of someone who had survived deeper boardroom betrayals. He slowly closed the laptop and folded his hands in front of him, his fingers interlaced in stillness. His voice, when it came, was calm and almost polite. "My ticket is for 1A. Clark's lips twitched. He glanced at the screen attached to the clipboard, then back at Jeremiah. "It's been reassigned," he said with casual cruelty. "A board member needs that seat. Please cooperate." For a moment, time thinned. Around them, the lounge buzzed softly with travelers sipping lattes and checking watches, oblivious to the tension coiled in the air. Jeremiah's eyes, sharp and measured, locked onto Clark's. He could have protested. He could have shown the electronic confirmation again. Instead, he stood, not with aggression, not with indignation, but with something far colder, precision. He adjusted his tailored charcoal blazer with a single, practiced motion. The weight of a decision, centuries old in corporate behavior, settled around them. Status above merit. Image over substance. Jeremiah picked up his briefcase, the titanium handle smooth beneath his fingers. "Understood," he said softly. Clark let out a relieved breath, mistaking silence for surrender. He turned on his heel and walked away with the clip of authority echoing behind him. What Clark didn't see was the flicker in Jeremiah's eyes, the brief, blade-like glint of calculation. It wasn't the downgrade that bothered him. It was the signal, because just 2 weeks prior, Jeremiah had quietly acquired 17% of Orinox Capital, the parent company behind Sylvain Air. The move had been shadowed, built through shell trusts and strategic silence. He hadn't planned to act on it until after his destination meeting in Drenlock City. But now, the timeline had accelerated. The trigger wasn't a financial crisis or regulatory breach. It was a seat. As Jeremiah exited the lounge, he passed by an ornate gold plaque that read, "For preferred elite members only." He paused, not to read it, but to note the subtle crack forming near the corner of the frame. Small but visible. He smiled to himself. Foreshadowing, perhaps. The jet bridge was filled with the usual shuffling chaos. Attendants directed passengers with cheerful indifference. As Jeremiah stepped onto the plane, a junior flight crew member greeted him, glanced at his boarding pass, then tilted his head awkwardly. "Ah, yes, seat 34C, right near the wing." Jeremiah nodded wordlessly and made his way down the aisle. The walk felt longer than usual. He passed first class, elegantly lit, with reclining leather and champagne flutes already clinking. Past business class, sleek and efficient. Finally, he reached economy, where the scent of reheated meals and recycled air thickened. 34C was sandwiched between a college student munching trail mix and a traveling salesman typing furiously on his tablet. Jeremiah sat down. His knees bumped the seat in front. The seatbelt clasp clicked with a dull snap. Around him, life went on. A child cried in the background. Someone coughed. The flight attendant offered a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jeremiah took out his phone, not to scroll, but to text. "Seat denied. Execute the second wave. Confirm within 10. The message was short. It went to Felix Murin, his personal strategist and the architect of the acquisition maneuver. They had mapped out multiple contingencies, but this one hadn't just been anticipated, it had been quietly hoped for. A public gesture of disregard was the last puzzle piece. Now, the escalation protocol would begin. Jeremiah opened a secure file on his device, scanning through share transfer authorizations, capital call projections, and board amendment triggers. He tapped one icon labeled Directive B, Equity Override, Post-Humiliation Clause. Felix had named it with a sense of dry humor. His eyes lifted briefly toward the front of the plane. Through the narrow slit between seat rows, he could make out 1A. The man now sitting there was pale, with slicked-back hair and a navy pinstripe suit. Bryce Dornwell. Jeremiah knew the face well, majority shareholder, image-obsessed, and known for prioritizing what he often called aesthetic branding. Jeremiah didn't need to be told. Bryce had ordered the change. Of course he had. And Bryce, sipping his champagne with smug oblivion, had just made a mistake that would echo through the corporate chambers for years. Because buried deep in Airline Capital's operating charter was a seldom invoked clause, one that allowed a hostile equity pivot if a shareholder with significant interest was publicly and deliberately displaced under discriminatory or brand-conflicting pretenses. Jeremiah had written that clause, back when he was just an advisor, back when they didn't think he'd remember. A soft chime rang overhead as the final boarding call echoed through the cabin. The doors sealed. The engines stirred to life. Jeremiah looked down at his device again. A single message popped onto the screen. Confirmed. Final tranche executing. The corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly. Not in vengeance. Not in celebration. In inevitability. Some seats are taken. Others are reclaimed with interest. The economy cabin groaned with fluorescent flicker and shoulder-to-shoulder chaos as Jeremiah Voss lowered himself into the middle of row 29. There was no ceremony, no courtesy. Just the scrape of a worn seatbelt buckle and the indifferent chatter of a man beside him explaining loudly into his phone why his flight had to be rescheduled. Jeremiah adjusted the cuff of his blazer, now cramped between two armrests. His knees pressed awkwardly against the seat in front of him. His spine curved slightly, not from defeat, but calculation. He unlocked his phone. No emotion flickered across his face, but beneath the surface, his mind was racing. Not with panic, with precision. The screen displayed a draft. Final acquisition clause prepared by Felix Murrin, his assistant. The moment Clark Rendell had downgraded him publicly, and without a moment's hesitation, it had ignited a fuse Jeremiah had been wiring in silence for the past 6 months. Airline Capital, the parent company of Sylvain Air, had been bleeding capital slowly, its board distracted by cosmetic pivots instead of real reform. What they didn't know was that someone had been quietly scooping up distressed shares, under an alias, spread across multiple shell firms. That someone was now seated beside a toddler kicking the back of the seat and a man with earbuds who occasionally hummed offbeat to whatever he was listening to. Jeremiah's thumb hovered over the screen. He didn't text in anger. He texted with timing. Push the remaining shares. Confirm in 5. The message vanished. He exhaled through his nose, steady. His fingers folding the phone gently into his coat pocket like a dealer slipping away a royal flush before the final bet. 3 rows ahead, the reclined comfort of seat 1A held a pale man with perfectly parted blonde hair and a navy pinstripe suit. A flute of champagne glittered in his hand, catching the overhead lights. Bryce Dornwell. Jeremiah's eyes rested on him, not with bitterness, but recognition. Bryce had always treated branding as performance art. He talked of market optics and heritage tones, but everyone on the board knew what he really meant. That their airline had to look a certain way to be trusted. That certain way had never included people like Jeremiah Voss, not in the front of the plane, and definitely not holding equity. That smug preference had just triggered the deepest clause in Airline's charter, a silent buyout override, which activated when a majority holder's rights were infringed without due process. Bryce didn't know that clause existed. He hadn't read that far. Jeremiah had. He helped write it. From behind him, the beverage cart clattered down the aisle. The attendant barely glanced his way. Pretzels or cookie? Nothing, thank you, Jeremiah said, voice smooth. She moved on without pause. He leaned back, the seat groaning under his height, then pulled his coat tighter as the cabin cooled. There was something beautifully ironic about this. being reduced to nothing but a ticket number, a face among hundreds, just as the ownership of the entire operation slipped into his hands. A child cried. A man cursed under his breath about a broken reading light. Jeremiah remained silent. His mind was elsewhere, counting shares, tracing the path of a hostile acquisition masked as inconvenience. Bryce Dornwell had made a public decision based on image. But Jeremiah had been making private moves based on structure. One triggered a reassignment. The other triggered control. His phone vibrated. Transfer confirmed. A single sentence. Nothing else. But Jeremiah's heart ticked once against his ribs like the closing of a vault. He didn't smile, didn't shift. But inside, something locked into place. Somewhere near the cockpit, Clark Rendell was laughing with a steward about how some people don't understand seniority. The tone of entitlement carried down the aisle like stale perfume. Jeremiah heard it without reaction. Clark hadn't just embarrassed the wrong man. He'd drawn a red line through his own career, and he'd done it on autopilot. It wasn't even personal. That was the problem. It had never occurred to him to wonder who Jeremiah really was. In a seat not far from 1A, another executive checked his email. No alerts yet. No storm warning. But they were already in it. Bryce Dornwell sipped champagne, glancing out the window with idle ease, unaware that his grip on the company had just shattered mid-flight like a thin glass against a closing overhead bin. The economy lights dimmed slightly as the cabin prepared for descent. A new turbulence loomed, not outside, but inside the corporate engine of Orinox. And still, Jeremiah didn't move. He had no reason to stand yet. Let the system catch up to him. Let the updates roll through like delayed thunder after a lightning strike. When you move the wrong piece off the board, don't be surprised if the game resets around you. The notification pinged like a quiet drumbeat before war. Jeremiah Voss's eyes flicked to the screen of his device. A single line glowed across the display. Final tranche complete. 52% equity confirmed. Authority transferred. The corner of his mouth lifted, not in triumph, but in confirmation. Felix had done it. While Jeremiah sat in seat 28C, knees wedged behind a reclined tray table, the balance of power in the cabin and the company had just shifted entirely in his favor. He didn't move. Not yet. The cabin hummed with casual indifference. A child kicked the back of his seat. A businessman across the aisle mumbled into a headset about market numbers. Jeremiah let the chaos settle around him like a shield. He knew what was about to unfold, and unlike the men who thrived on announcements and applause, he preferred precision. 5 minutes. That was the trigger built into the back-end equity algorithm, designed to automatically push a system-wide alert through all administrative nodes across Orinox Capital's infrastructure, including airline operational tablets on board. Cabin managers, dispatchers, and even security crew would be notified that a new directive had been issued, and that one man now carried authority over all decisions made in flight. His fingers rested on the armrest, calm but coiled. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here to make a statement, one the system itself would deliver. The silence didn't last long. Clark Rendell, still basking in the petty victory of a reassignment he believed was his right, strolled down the aisle from the front. A forced chuckle escaped his lips as a young flight attendant beside him shared a joke. The casual arrogance in his gait was unmistakable. Then he paused, caught mid-step. There sat Jeremiah. Clark's smile faltered but recovered quickly, trained corporate charm kicking in. "Hope the seat's not too cramped for you, mister?" he asked, leaning slightly, clipboard tucked against his side like a trophy. Jeremiah didn't blink. Voss. Jeremiah Voss. The name landed like a coin in a well, silent at first, then rippling out. Clark squinted, the name clearly pricking at the edge of memory. But before he could form a reply, a sharp tone crackled through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received a system update. Please stand by for cabin instruction." The atmosphere changed instantly. Passengers looked up, half listening. But among the crew a different energy stirred. Eyes widened. Devices beeped. The chain reaction had begun. 2 rows up, a senior attendant pulled a folded printout from the communications panel and briskly made his way toward Clark. His hands trembled just slightly as he extended the page. Clark took it. His eyes scanned the lines. The color drained from his face like a punctured canteen. The words stared back. Effective immediately, all operational decisions must be deferred to Mr. Jeremiah Voss, acting majority authority of Orinox Capital Holdings. For a long, stretched moment, Clark didn't breathe. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked at Jeremiah, no longer as an economy passenger, but as something else entirely. Something unignorable. Jeremiah rose. He didn't hurry. His movements were deliberate, like a man walking to a podium, not a confrontation. The passengers parted in stunned silence, some already sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding in their midst. Clark stumbled backward to give way, lips parted in shock, clipboard nearly dropping from his hand. Whatever insult he had meant to deliver earlier had now turned to dust in his mouth. Jeremiah's shoes moved steadily down the narrow aisle. Around him, tension coiled tighter, but he carried none of it. No anger, no gloating, just purpose. As he passed row after row, passengers leaned in. Murmurs rose. Isn't that the guy who? Wait. He's in charge now? Who is he? He reached the business class divider just as the front cabin crew received their update. The captain emerged, reading his own version of the directive, then stepped aside wordlessly. It wasn't theater. It was transition. Jeremiah adjusted his blazer as he approached the first-class section. His original seat visible now, occupied by a man who had unknowingly triggered this entire domino effect. That confrontation would come soon enough. But for now, Jeremiah glanced back down the aisle where Clark still stood, stunned, breath shallow, reality crashing in. Only then did Jeremiah speak, voice low but steady, perfectly audible in the silence that had fallen over the entire aircraft. You took my seat, but I just took your job. The murmurs began the moment Jeremiah Voss stepped back into the first-class cabin. Not flanked, not announced, just present. Heads turned as if a new gravity had entered the space. Attendants froze mid-service. Passengers paused mid-sip. Every eye tracked the quiet man walking forward, not as someone reclaiming a seat, but as someone about to redraw the lines of the flight itself. Jeremiah moved with steady steps, his face calm, unreadable. He stopped beside seat 1A, where Bryce Dornwell lounged, one leg crossed, fingers delicately curled around a glass of champagne. Bryce barely looked up at first. Something wrong in economy? He muttered without interest. Jeremiah didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch until Bryce glanced at him with faint annoyance. That seat was never yours, Jeremiah said, voice smooth but firm. Bryce blinked slowly, as if registering a language he didn't quite speak. Excuse me? His tone carried that habitual condescension, the kind that expected deference, not correction. Before Bryce could finish the thought, a young attendant approached and leaned down to whisper in his ear. Her hand trembled slightly as she held the slip of paper. Bryce's lips moved as he read. The color drained from his cheeks. He lowered the champagne glass with exaggerated care, but his eyes darted nervously from the paper to Jeremiah. From behind them, the cockpit door clicked open. The pilot, a tall man with silver hair and a lined face, stepped out, his expression composed but alert. Without hesitation, he faced Jeremiah and offered a brief but unmistakable salute. Mr. Voss, he said, his voice quiet, professional. We can clear the cockpit if you'd prefer a private consultation. Jeremiah shook his head. No need to move, he replied. His voice wasn't loud, but in that charged silence, every syllable rang out. He turned to the row of first-class passengers, most of whom had stopped mid-conversation, some holding phones just low enough to capture without being obvious. All eyes were fixed on him. My name is Jeremiah Voss, he began, speaking with the calm rhythm of someone who had waited a long time for this moment. As of 5 minutes ago, I am the acting majority authority over this airline. A few gasps escaped from the passengers. One man in row 2A dropped his phone. Another leaned sideways for a clearer view, stunned. Effective now, Jeremiah continued. Several personnel changes will be enacted. He turned his head deliberately toward the crew at the galley. Clark Rendell is no longer part of this flight's operation. Please ensure he's documented and rerouted upon landing. The cabin seemed to shrink. The air itself pulled tight by the weight of what had just been said. Clark, who had been whispering to another attendant a few feet away, turned sharply. "What is this?" he blurted, voice cracking. One of the senior stewards stepped forward, holding a device. The screen showed the official directive, signed, time-stamped, and sealed. Clark's expression fell from confusion to panic. Bryce sat frozen. The champagne glass wobbled in his grip, then tipped slightly, spilling onto his trousers. He didn't notice. You can't just," Bryce stammered, trying to summon a version of control he no longer owned. "I already have," Jeremiah said. He didn't look at Bryce when he said it. He looked ahead, to the quiet crew, to the stunned passengers, to the horizon beyond the cabin windows. There was no triumph in his voice, only finality. He stepped forward, turned slightly, and sat down in seat 1A. He did not recline. He did not sigh. He simply fastened his seatbelt with the soft click of a man reclaiming what had always been his, on a deeper level than any ticket could show. The hum of the aircraft returned. The tension hung for a few moments longer, then dispersed slowly, like a current of realization. Conversation resumed in low tones. A few attendants resumed their work with renewed caution. But a shift had taken place, one you could feel in the way people looked at the man in 1A. He didn't need the seat to prove who he was. But taking it back, without anger or spectacle, made the truth undeniable. True ownership isn't printed on a ticket. It's written in the ink of consequence. The digital chime echoed through the frosted glass halls of Orinox Capital's executive suite. Majority ownership transfer executed. Jeremiah Voss. The words blinked on the central dashboard screen, subtle yet seismic. Bryce Dornwell's assistant, a young man named Keaton Mars, stood mid-sip of his morning espresso when the alert appeared. His hand trembled, the cup slipping slightly, splashing dark streaks across his shirt. He froze. His eyes darted between the blinking notification and the closed office door just beyond him. Inside sat Bryce, unaware, unready, and as always, convinced of his own invincibility. 30,000 feet above, in the tightly pressurized hush of Flight 711, Bryce Dornwell's entire reputation began to plummet, an invisible freefall untracked by altimeters. Jeremiah Voss sat calmly, the cabin's ambient noise washing over him like distant waves. There was no announcement, no applause, no dramatic music. Just the quiet rustle of an envelope being slid across the polished surface of the folding tray between him and Bryce. "This is your revised role," Jeremiah said evenly, his voice low but unyielding. Bryce hesitated. The man who had once dictated dress codes based on brand optics now fumbled with a standard envelope as if it were a live wire. His fingers tore at the flap with nervous urgency, knuckles pale. Inside, a sleek document with black and gray headers outlined his immediate reassignment. Effective now. Regional consulting. Pending conduct review. "You can't just erase me," Bryce snapped, voice cracking as he glanced over the paragraphs. His words less a protest than a plea for control. Jeremiah tilted his head slightly. His gaze neither cruel nor triumphant, just measured. "I didn't erase you," he replied. "You did that when you made a seat about status, not merit." Bryce blinked, caught between indignation and disbelief. Around them, first-class passengers tried not to stare too directly, but their stolen glances carried weight. Even the flight attendants moved with a new caution. Power had changed hands, but the man at the center of it wasn't celebrating, he was executing. 2 rows back, the pilot's tablet buzzed with a secondary directive. The note was succinct. Upon landing, press embargo lifts. Official statement to follow. Captain Bren Arlo read it once, then again, slower, realizing the gravity. He turned slightly to glance down the aisle toward Jeremiah. This wasn't a personnel update. This was an axis shift. Far below, Servers updated silently. Newsrooms refreshed dormant drafts. Financial analysts checked and rechecked their forecasts. The corporate world braced itself for what was coming. For most of them, the news would arrive like a thunderclap. But for Bryce Dornwell, it arrived one paper cut at a time. He continued to scan the reassignment letter, each paragraph stripping a layer off the polished image he'd spent years curating. There were no loopholes, no soft landings. The review clause alone was enough to freeze his access to most internal systems. Worse yet, Jeremiah had cited a rarely used protocol in the operating charter, Section 6B, Executive Conflict Resolution by Majority Owner. Bryce had signed off on that clause years ago, dismissing it as a formality. He had never imagined it would be used against him, especially not like this. The flight was smooth, but Bryce's hands trembled. His champagne sat untouched. Across from him, Jeremiah returned to his tablet, not with gloating, but with focus. He was already several steps ahead, reviewing the timeline for the post-landing release, coordinating with Felix back at Ventron headquarters, ensuring that the media outlets would all receive the statement simultaneously. Bryce finally looked up. "This will damage perception," he muttered. "Investors hate instability." Jeremiah's eyes didn't rise from the screen. "They hate ignorance more." Bryce slumped back into his seat. Around him, the cabin had changed, not physically, but perceptually. He was no longer the man everyone deferred to. He was the lesson they were learning from. The envelope on his lap felt heavier by the second. Near the rear galley, a flight attendant whispered into the intercom. "Cabin is secure." The voice barely carried. But the real message had already flown ahead of them, through terminals, through networks, through the very infrastructure Bryce had helped maintain. The world would soon know Ventron Dynamics had taken majority control of Orinox Capital. And more importantly, why? For Jeremiah, it wasn't just a transaction, it was a restoration. Of balance, of merit, of quiet authority that didn't need applause to be felt. He glanced briefly out the window. The clouds below parted slightly, revealing threads of distant coastline. They were descending. Landing would come soon. Bryce sat there, shoulders stiff, eyes distant. He finally understood what had happened. Not the paperwork. Not the press release. The seat he took from Jeremiah hadn't just backfired. It had become the very spark that enabled a full systemic takeover. You don't lose a throne when it's stolen. You lose it when you forget who was quietly building the palace. The jet's wheels hissed against the tarmac as Flight 711 came to a smooth stop, but Jeremiah Voss didn't move. Seatbelt signs chimed off. Overhead bins opened. Passengers stood, gathering their bags with the usual haste of arrival. But he remained seated in 1A, hands folded, eyes fixed on the front bulkhead. He wasn't in a rush to exit. Moments like these weren't seized. They were crafted. As the last of the economy passengers shuffled out, Jeremiah finally stood, adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal blazer, and retrieved his briefcase from the overhead compartment with the same grace one would expect from a man stepping into a boardroom, not stepping off a plane. The door opened with a faint hiss, and sunlight spilled into the cabin. A shadow cut across the threshold. A line of men in navy suits stood waiting on the tarmac, the glint of polished shoes and metallic badge clips signaling more than just a welcoming committee. At the front was Arlen Crow, Jeremiah's legal strategist. He stepped forward the moment Jeremiah emerged, offering a sleek black tablet with the dashboard already active. The screen displayed the cascading changes in real time. All active airline operations now report to Voss Aeronautical Oversight, Authorized Executive Entity. The air seemed thicker, not with heat, but with revelation. Jeremiah took the tablet, glanced at the figures, and nodded once. No words, no theatrics. Behind the security rope near the terminal, Clark Rendell stood stiffly, hands clasped in front of him like a boy caught in the wrong room. His badge had been replaced with a generic visitor pass. Sweat gathered at his temple, though the breeze was cool. He stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Voss, I had no idea." Jeremiah didn't look up from the screen. He only spoke once the silence had made Clark shift uncomfortably. "That's the problem," Jeremiah said calmly, his voice level and deliberate. You didn't care to know. Clark opened his mouth again, but before another word could escape, a voice echoed across the terminal concourse. Mr. Voss, is it true you now own Sylvain Air? A reporter in a Navy windbreaker had made it past the velvet ropes, microphone in hand, voice shaking slightly from the knowledge that he was witnessing something much bigger than a corporate shuffle. The camera lights flared. Phones lifted. Whispers turned into a wave of anticipation. Jeremiah stepped forward, not to claim the spotlight, but to control its angle. He walked to the press podium that had been hastily assembled at the edge of the private terminal. Behind him, Felix Murren's face appeared on a mounted screen via live video feed, eyes scanning the metrics as he spoke. Media embargo lifts in 60 seconds, Felix said, and the airport's press office is preparing a public statement. Jeremiah didn't acknowledge him right away. He adjusted the mic slightly and surveyed the room. To the left stood a pilot with the Sylvain crest on his sleeve, watching with measured curiosity. To the right, Clark remained frozen, as if unsure whether to flee or fold into the floor. Airport security kept their distance, eyes darting between press badges and corporate lanyards. But all eyes fell back to Jeremiah as he cleared his throat, not loudly, but firmly enough that silence returned. Ownership, he began, is a term people use to feel powerful, to signal control. But that's not what today is about. He looked over the sea of faces, each man holding his breath, some recording, others simply absorbing. I didn't buy this airline to own it. I bought it to prove something. When dignity is removed, power doesn't get angry. His voice never wavered. His eyes never blinked. He was no longer addressing one airline, one press corps, or one mistake. He was speaking to every boardroom that mistook silence for surrender, and every face that judged without understanding. It gets strategic. Cameras clicked like a cascade of dominoes. The first wave of tweets had already gone live. In the background, screens flickered with updates. Breaking: Voss acquires Orinox Capital. Airline CEO removed mid-flight. Now commands entire fleet. Jeremiah stepped back from the mic and folded his hands behind his back. Somewhere near the edge of the crowd, Clark's shoulders visibly dropped. He turned away slowly, as if realizing, finally, that the seat he had taken was never really his to assign. Jeremiah didn't look after him. His attention had shifted, toward the cameras, the questions, the change already beginning to churn beyond the glass. And as the press murmured and markets reacted in distant skyscrapers, Jeremiah Voss stood still, steady as a pillar carved from silence and foresight. This wasn't revenge. It was architecture. The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence that didn't just hang in the air. It weighed it down. One by one, the members of the former Orinox Capital Board filed into the chamber, their footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor and glass-paneled walls. Some clutched leather binders, others just their pride. Every man seated around the long obsidian conference table wore a tailored suit and an expression painted with skepticism, confusion, or thinly veiled fear. The overhead lights were cold, clinical, and unblinking, just like the man waiting at the head of the table. Jeremiah Voss didn't rise when they entered. He didn't need to. He simply sat there, hands steepled before him, watching. His face was calm, unreadable, but the message in his stillness was unmistakable. He controlled this room now, and they knew it. A beat of silence followed. A few brows furrowed. One of the senior board members, a silver-haired man named Keenan Rull, leaned back with a skeptical smirk. "Teach us?" he scoffed. "Is this a lecture or a leadership stunt?" Jeremiah paused behind Keenan, then kept walking, unaffected. "It's an invitation," he said, "to rebuild a system you helped tarnish." He tapped a small remote, and the screen. He reached the aircraft and laid a hand on the smooth curve of the fuselage. "Start it," he said. The lead technician, a wiry man named Corin Drell, approached hesitantly. "Sir, Sylvain mothballed this model years ago. Fuel efficiency was ahead of its time, but the board didn't approve the hybrid AI system. Said it would spook traditional pilots and sink too much capital." "Start it," Jeremiah repeated, voice calm but final. Cora nodded and turned toward the control station. As the system's whirred to life, Jeremiah's eyes moved over the digital schematics projected on the wall. Fuel cell routing, AI flight path logic, real-time atmospheric analytics, it was all still there, untouched, forgotten. He turned to his assistant, Elias Marrow, who had entered silently behind him. "This," Jeremiah said, "isn't about engines. It's about ethics. We're not just pushing innovation. We're pushing intention." Elias tapped something on his tablet. "Budget's ready. Do you want this filed under the main innovation branch?" Jeremiah shook his head. "No. This isn't just another product line. We're starting a new division. Name it Project Axis." The hangar doors rumbled shut behind them, sealing the quiet storm of change inside. Jeremiah stood still, watching the artificial horizon light up on the cockpit screen, the AI calibration initializing. For a moment, he allowed himself a rare flicker of pride, not arrogance, but clarity. Sylvain Air had buried this project in a box labeled, "Too early." What they meant was too inconvenient. But now, the one man they underestimated had the authority to decide what was possible. Later that afternoon, Jeremiah held a series of meetings in a side room adjoining the hangar. Unlike the polished boardrooms he was used to, this one smelled faintly of oil and coffee. Seated around the metal table were flight attendants, tarmac workers, mid-tier managers, and even a few former passengers who had filed grievances in the past. "No executives. No suites. Just real people. I need your truth," he said, standing before them with rolled sleeves and open hands. "Tell me what makes this airline fail, not in headlines but in habits. Tell me where dignity gets ignored." At first, the room was hesitant. Then a ground worker named Ryland spoke up. "No one listens until something explodes," he said quietly. "You want better standards? Start with the ones that aren't written down." That cracked the silence. One by one, they spoke about overlooked complaints, disrespectful superiors, racially skewed seating practices, and the way certain passengers were subtly prioritized. Jeremiah listened, took notes, and when it ended, he didn't promise sweeping changes. He promised presence. "Project Axis doesn't just redesign the aircraft," he said. "It redesigns the experience of being seen." Back at headquarters that evening, a different storm brewed. Clark Rendell, recently stripped of authority, had given a private interview to a low-tier news outlet, trying to discredit the buyout. In it, he claimed Jeremiah had used unethical leverage, and insisted the reassignment from Seat 1A had nothing to do with bias. "He simply didn't fit the profile," Clark had said. "He didn't look like our usual VIPs. The video never made it to mainstream media." Jeremiah saw to that, but it didn't vanish. Instead, he had the clip quietly delivered to Bryce Dornwell's private inbox, along with a single line highlighted in yellow. "He didn't look like our usual VIPs." Bryce watched the clip in silence from his quiet corner office in Braddock Holdings, where he now served as a demoted regional consultant. The words echoed in his head, not just because of their cruelty, but because he had once believed them too. He hadn't said it out loud, but he didn't need to. Clark had done it for him. Jeremiah never called Bryce, never mentioned it, never needed to. His message was delivered without confrontation, just clarity. A truth that lingered, undeniable. That night, as Jeremiah walked back into the hangar to inspect AX-9 under night lighting, Elias stood beside him. "Should we respond to Rendell's remarks? Might be good PR." Jeremiah shook his head. "No. Noise only covers rot. I'd rather let them see what we're building." As he looked up at the sleek body of the aircraft, now fully powered for ground testing, the symbol of everything this battle had brought to light, he saw more than just metal and algorithms. He saw a future rebuilt not on titles or tickets, but on trust. You don't fight darkness with noise. You expose it with clarity. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you," Matteo said, his hand trembling slightly as he poured the sparkling water into Jeremiah's glass. His voice was low, careful, almost reverent, not the tone of a flight attendant doing his job, but of a man breaking silence for something deeper. A lot of us saw what happened that day. It changed how we feel coming to work. Jeremiah looked up slowly, the cabin lights casting a soft gold hue across his features. His eyes met Mateo's, steady, unshaken, but not cold. The younger man's face bore signs of cautious hope, as if he didn't expect his words to matter but needed to speak them anyway. Jeremiah set his glass down gently and nodded. "We all have a seat in something bigger than us," he said, voice calm but grounded with weight. The words landed not like a statement, but like an offering. Mateo gave a small, respectful bow of the head before stepping back, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The engines hummed steadily beneath them, and the altitude felt peaceful, but Jeremiah's thoughts never sat idle. This wasn't just another flight, it was a route to the Alaris Summit, a global gathering of transportation innovators and regulators. He'd been invited not just as a guest, but as a speaker, a symbol. Still, he didn't travel to be applauded. He came to keep listening. Just as he reached for his tablet, a discreet notification pulsed across the secure channel of his device. It was not the usual board update or summit itinerary. This one was encrypted and unsigned. To Mr. Voss, I work for Tralix Aero. I've stayed quiet for years, but what you did gave me a reason. Our airline's been hiding patterns, internal suppression of certain complaints, selective reassignments, falsified records. I've seen pilots reprimanded for speaking up. I've seen others rewarded for staying silent. The stain is real. I'm including data logs. Do what I can't. Silence isn't safety anymore. Jeremiah read the message twice, his thumb hovering above the screen before slowly scrolling through the attached files. They were legitimate. Timestamps, incident codes, testimony excerpts. The language was bureaucratic, cold, yet the truth was unmistakable. Behind neatly worded phrases were lives minimized and voices buried. It wasn't just misconduct. It was engineered invisibility. He looked out the window, past the clouds, past the moment. The irony burned quietly. He was seated in 1A, finally restored to where he once was denied. But now the view wasn't one of triumph. It was responsibility. His fingers moved with precision. He copied the encrypted logs to a secured cloud, added a timestamp brief for his reform team, and looped in 2 legal advisors from the Sky Ethic unit. As the files uploaded, he drafted a short note. Whistle received. Integrity Response Task Force activated. We carry your silence with honor and break it with clarity. He hit send. The cabin remained still, unaware. A man across the aisle sipped from a glass of wine, thumbing through a magazine without knowing the kind of shift that had just occurred 30 inches away. Another man snoozed under a blanket, his head leaning against the window, breathing evenly. But inside Jeremiah's mind, the next frontier was forming. The movement wasn't slowing, it was expanding. Later in the flight, a turbulence bump shook the cabin gently. Nothing severe, just enough to wake a few passengers. But Jeremiah didn't flinch. He welcomed it. It reminded him that comfort and progress rarely ride in the same lane. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the anonymous message settle in his chest like an anchor and a compass at once. Someone out there had risked everything because he had once refused to rise in anger, because he had chosen patience, because he had let consequence, not chaos, make the loudest sound. As the flight coasted into descent, the sun peeked over the horizon, casting an orange thread across the skyline. Jeremiah glanced down at his now blank screen. He didn't need another message. He had enough. He turned to the window again. For a long moment he said nothing. And then, almost in a whisper to himself, he murmured, "When one seat shifts, the whole cabin learns to balance." The first report landed on Jeremiah's desk at 7:43 a.m., sharp and silent. It was an internal bulletin from a rival airline, Arcent Air, revealing they had quietly initiated an overhaul of their employee conduct guidelines. The changes mirrored Jeremiah's Sky Ethics standards almost word for word. No press release, no public credit, just quiet mimicry driven by fear of being next. He set the folder aside and tapped his knuckle twice against the polished edge of his desk. Across from him, Felix Murin, his ever-composed assistant, waited without speaking. He didn't need to ask why Jeremiah had gone quiet. The message was clear. The ripple was working. But Jeremiah's eyes weren't on his competitors. They were on the floor beneath him. Not the literal floor, the corporate structure. "We're not finished," he said quietly and stood. "It's time we step into the light." Later that day, he stood before the Skyethic division. Just 35 men gathered in a sunlit conference hall at Ventron HQ. They weren't executives. They were baggage handlers, mechanics, call center agents, and flight attendants. All male. All chosen based on conduct and compassion metrics, not resume gloss. They looked nervous. One of them, Jonah Wren, a bearded gate supervisor from Midvale Airport, finally asked the question circling in their minds. "Sir, why us?" Jeremiah didn't touch the podium. He walked to the middle of the room, sleeves rolled just high enough to show he wasn't there for ceremony. "Because every rule you've ever followed was written without asking you first. That changes now. You don't work under this company anymore. You are this company." There was a pause, a stillness that only comes when people realize they're being taken seriously for the first time. Then quiet nods. They understood. By week's end, Skyethic wasn't just a department. It was a movement. Every new policy had to pass through this council. Every complaint logged by passengers now received a 3-stage review, with each level overseen by someone who had once stood at the gate instead of behind glass. Jeremiah had stripped down the hierarchy, and the world took notice. But the most shocking move came when Jeremiah summoned a third-party firm to perform an internal audit on himself. "Sir," Arlen Crow, his legal strategist, had blinked at him. "You're requesting scrutiny? Voluntarily?" Jeremiah nodded without hesitation. "If I expect others to evolve, I must stand under the same light." The audit took 3 weeks. Every board decision, every acquisition tactic, every staff reassignment. It was dissected without mercy. The findings? Jeremiah wasn't perfect. He had failed to follow through on 2 earlier inclusivity grants. One report found he had unknowingly signed off on a supplier with a history of wage complaints. He didn't deflect. He didn't spin. He posted the full audit online. The transparency caused a stir. Some critics called it naive. But most saw it for what it was. A man inviting accountability, not fearing it. At a shareholder meeting 2 weeks later, Jeremiah stood beneath the glass dome of the Voss conference atrium. The energy was tense but curious. One shareholder, a stern logistics magnate named Cornvale, leaned forward and muttered, "This will crash the stock." Didn't. Instead, as analysts broke down the metrics over the next 72 hours, something strange happened. Investor confidence didn't fall. It soared. Staff retention rates had jumped 12%. Passenger satisfaction was at an all-time high. Complaints had dropped across all regions. And for the first time in 4 years, Orinox Capital posted a back-to-back quarterly growth curve that beat projections. Other CEOs watched, silent, nervous. Some rolled their eyes in private. Others leaned closer to their own mirrors. One evening, as Jeremiah reviewed the final graphs, Felix entered with a tray of coffees and a note. "Another airline just followed," Felix said. "They've adopted full Skyethic review boards. No press, just internal change." Jeremiah sipped slowly. His office was quiet, the only sound a ticking analog clock on the wall, gifted by the cabin crew who had once seen him removed from seat 1A. He didn't smile, but he allowed himself one deep breath. One thought, all of it, every ripple, every resignation, every rewritten rule, had started with one quiet moment. A man who had chosen patience over rage. Legacy begins where ego ends. Elian Vale's hand trembled slightly as he knocked once on the glass door of the executive conference suite. The same man who once smirked at Jeremiah Voss's demotion to economy class now stood waiting to request his guidance. Jeremiah was already inside, seated at the long obsidian conference table, reviewing policy revisions on a digital slate. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. No assistant. No fanfare. Just purpose. Jeremiah didn't look up immediately. He let the silence stretch, not out of arrogance, but calculation. Elian shifted awkwardly before speaking. I appreciate you agreeing to see me. Elian began, voice taut with rehearsed humility. We've had our share of incidents lately. Passenger reports, crew turnover. And after watching what Skyethic did at Sylvain, I'd like to... You'd like to license it, Jeremiah interrupted, finally raising his gaze. His voice was even calm, unreadable. Yes, Elian nodded quickly. Integrate it across Helivant's airways. Our board is aligned. We're ready to adopt the model. Jeremiah leaned back, folding his hands across his chest. You laughed when I was pulled from 1A. The words landed like quiet thunder. Elian blinked, caught between defensiveness and shame. That was a long time ago. We all misjudged. No, Jeremiah corrected, standing. You judged correctly based on the world as it was. But what you failed to see was that the world was already changing underneath your feet. He paced slowly toward the window overlooking the airstrip, then turned. You won't just license Skyethic, he said, eyes sharp. You'll live it. Elian furrowed his brow. I'm not sure I follow. Jeremiah stepped closer, the space between them charged now with quiet force. Step down for 30 days. Remove the title. Spend that time shadowing your ground crew. Serve as a flight attendant. Carry trays. Handle delays. Hear complaints. Know their names. Then come back to me. Elian recoiled slightly. Step down. Yes. That's... Elian swallowed hard. A lot. It's the bare minimum, Jeremiah replied. Skyethic isn't a product. It's a reckoning. There was a long silence. Outside, a jet screamed into takeoff, its roar vibrating through the glass. Finally, Elian nodded once, slowly. All right, he said. You'll hear from me in a month. Jeremiah returned to his seat without a word. 30 days passed with no contact. Then, on a late Tuesday morning, Elian returned, unannounced, no entourage, no briefcase. His face was leaner. He wore a simple gray button-down, not a suit. The boardroom door opened slowly. Jeremiah looked up. I cleaned vomit off a tray table midair, Elian said quietly, voice cracking. I stood beside a baggage handler in -10 degrees. I helped a passenger who missed his father's funeral because our gate agent didn't scan the barcode correctly. He exhaled, hands clasped in front of him. I thought leadership was control, he said. Now I know it's service. Jeremiah rose and extended a hand, not out of triumph, but respect. Their handshake was firm and silent. There was no need to speak further. Word traveled. Other CEOs, watching closely, began asking questions not about profits but about purpose. Within months, Skyethic evolved from a company reform model into a movement, adopted not out of fear, but by example. Jeremiah didn't advertise it. He didn't need to. It traveled through the eyes of employees who felt seen, passengers who felt heard, and executives who finally felt what it meant to earn trust instead of expect it. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of Jeremiah's office, an envelope arrived. Cream stock. No letteread. No return address. Inside, a note. 5 handwritten words. I was wrong. Thank you. It was signed Bryce Dornwell. Jeremiah read it once, folded it, then slipped it into a folder marked Proof of Change. When power is humbled, it finally starts to lead. The boy's voice broke through the crowd like a ripple across still water. Is it true they kicked you out of your seat just 'cause you were different? A hush fell over the press conference. Cameras paused mid-click. Jeremiah Voss stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the question settle. Reporters watched from behind their monitors. Analysts from glass offices streamed it live. But all of that vanished in Jeremiah's mind. All he saw was the boy, maybe 10 years old, brown eyes wide with genuine curiosity, a press badge hanging awkwardly around his neck. The child wasn't challenging him. He wasn't fishing for a quote. He was just trying to understand the world. Jeremiah slowly stepped down from the podium, his polished shoes echoing softly across the marble floor. He approached the boy and knelt so they were eye level, his tailored navy suit creasing at the knees. A microphone hovered near them, but Jeremiah didn't look at it. "No," he said, his voice calm but unshakably firm. "They kicked me out because they thought I wouldn't come back stronger." The boy blinked, lips parted slightly, his eyes holding something between awe and hope. "And did you?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Jeremiah's smile was small, but it carried years of battles, patience, and silent strategy. "Stronger than they expected," he answered. Then softer, kinder than they deserved. The applause didn't erupt all at once. It built like a wave, cresting as realization dawned across the crowd. Lionel Kerr, standing near the wings of the stage, watched with tears quietly forming in the corners of his eyes. He had been the first hire under the new initiative Jeremiah was there to announce, the Global Experience Auditor Program. A year ago, Lionel had been just another economy passenger, invisible to the system until an incident reminded him how fragile dignity could be. Today, he wore a gray blazer with the embroidered insignia of the GA initiative and carried the quiet pride of someone seen for the first time. The press conference had been called to mark the one-year anniversary of the infamous Flight 711, the day Jeremiah Voss was removed from his rightful seat. But the event wasn't about a grudge. It was about a new policy rollout that would redefine how passengers were treated on every Sylvain Air flight. Effective today, Jeremiah had announced earlier, every Sylvain Air flight will include an anonymous rights monitor on board. Every passenger, regardless of seat, background, or income, can report mistreatment in real time through an AI-reviewed system with instant escalation protocols. No more paperwork. No more silence. Reporters scribbled notes, but many simply listened. One journalist from the Aero Times had muttered, "This could flip the entire industry." But Jeremiah didn't aim to flip anything. He aimed to build it better. And that's what made his mission powerful. Backstage, Felix Murrin had stood with Arlen Crow, both watching intently as the press conference unfolded. "It's more than optics now," Felix murmured. "It's infrastructure." Arlen nodded. He turned a humiliation into a framework. They tried to shrink him to fit their system. He reshaped the system instead. Not far from them, Clark Rendell, now a consultant working through bias training programs under the Sky Ethic Division, stood quietly, arms crossed. He had not been invited to speak. He knew better than to expect a microphone now. But he had come anyway. Watching Jeremiah, he didn't feel resentment. He felt remorse and, strangely, relief. In some ways, being removed from power had been the most honest moment of his career. Bryce Dornwell was absent, but his handwritten note had been discreetly delivered earlier that morning to Jeremiah's suite. 5 words, no letterhead. "I was wrong. Thank you." Now, as Jeremiah stood from kneeling before the boy, the applause continued, not the roaring kind that fades quickly, but the long, standing kind that lingers in hearts. The cameras didn't zoom in for spectacle. They panned out, catching the faces of passengers, crew members, former critics, and new allies. Jeremiah returned to the podium, composed. He looked out over the crowd and let the silence return before he spoke again. "This wasn't about revenge," he said, scanning the faces that now carried his vision forward. "It was about restoration. Because when you rebuild a broken chair, it becomes a throne, not just for you, but for everyone." The seatbelt light dinged, the cabin hushed, and as passengers shuffled aboard Flight 711, now etched into aviation history as the Voss legacy route, an elderly man stepped through the jet bridge. No security detail. No entourage. Just a slow, measured walk and a quiet presence wrapped in a soft navy suit that had seen more diplomacy than fashion. His gait had changed with age. Each step was careful but firm. The silver in his beard framed his face like a halo forged from endurance, and his cane tapped softly on the floor, echoing like a signature from a past still rippling through the present. He paused at the entrance of the aircraft, not out of fatigue but recognition. The subtle scent of pressurized air and lemon polish greeted him like an old companion. A young male flight attendant, no older than 28, scanned his boarding pass and looked up. There was a beat of silence. Then, a smile, reverent, almost awed. "This seat's been waiting for you, Mr. Voss." Jeremiah Voss nodded with a faint smile. "Thank you," he replied, voice textured by time yet steady as stone. He moved down the aisle with no announcement, no special welcome, but every crew member who caught sight of him stood a little straighter, as if a living standard had just passed them by. Seat 1A, his former exile, his reclaimed kingdom, sat undisturbed, plush, spotless, and turned slightly toward the window as if it, too, had been anticipating his return. He lowered himself slowly, pressing into the seat not like a man reclaiming territory, but like a father returning to a home he built for others. Outside the window, the tarmac glinted under a lavender dawn. A ground crew member waved as the jet prepared for pushback. The logo on the tail fin had been subtly redesigned, sleek, minimalist, bearing the letter V embedded in the wingtip. Not flamboyant, not loud, just there, undeniable, like the legacy it now represented. As the boarding continued, a young father walked down the aisle with his son, about 8 or 9 years old, clutching a toy model of a plane. The father held the boy's hand gently, guiding him forward, but the child stopped just beside seat 1A. He looked up, eyes wide, staring at Jeremiah the way someone stares at the face carved into a monument they'd only read about in schoolbooks. "Are you the man who changed the airline?" the boy asked, voice full of genuine curiosity, not rehearsed reverence. Jeremiah turned slightly, meeting the boy's eyes. There was no smirk, no theatrics, just the weight of truth balanced in his reply. "No," he said, his voice low and warm. "I'm just the man who refused to stay silent when it tried to change me." The father blinked, stunned into a brief silence. He gave a respectful nod before guiding his son down the aisle. The boy kept looking back, the way children do when they see something their heart understands before their mind catches up. The engines roared to life beneath them, and with a subtle tremor, the aircraft began to taxi. Jeremiah turned back toward the window, where the morning light caught on the metal wing, bright and unflinching. The sky ahead was open, not just for him, but for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong up front. The clouds parted, the wheels lifted, and so did a legacy stitched together by patience, precision, and principle. Sometimes, the seat they take from you becomes the very thing that lifts others higher. They removed him from VIP and learned he was the one signing their paychecks. If you believe respect should never depend on appearance, subscribe now, because justice always boards first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, prejudice, and the dramatic consequences that unfold when bias is exposed by truth and authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every individual, regardless of appearance or status.